Elmendorf. I appreciated working with the Congressional Budget Office when I was on the House Budget Committee, and of course at OMB. We didn't get a chance to work together since you came after that, but I appreciate your testimony today. And we find ourselves here at a very difficult time, don't we? You know, a day after you've told us that we're facing the biggest deficit in the history of our country, in fact, in the history of the world this year. And by the way, these projections are notoriously wrong. Unfortunately, this one looks like it's more accurate than some. I think Senator Whitehouse, perhaps inadvertently, just explained to us how wrong CBO projections can be sometimes, as they were in 2000. But the fact remains, we face a fiscal crisis. And, you know, I'm delighted to be on this committee. I just found out last night I was going to be joining Senator Conrad, Senator Sessions, and others. And I was really encouraged, as much as I was discouraged by your projections, encouraged by what I heard today from my colleagues, including you, Mr. Chairman, and you, Mr. Sessions. And I think what you said earlier, Chairman Conrad, is very significant in terms of looking perhaps at beyond a 5-year, maybe a 10-year budget, and also trying on a bipartisan way to do what all of us, I think, acknowledge needs to be done, which is to find common ground and solve this crisis before we have the kind of economic repercussions you talked about earlier. I had a couple of questions that I wanted to focus on, and that really kind of just go to me understanding more how you feel about this crisis in your gut. If you were to say, what is the single largest fiscal crisis or fiscal problem, fiscal issue facing our country today, what would you say it is, if you had to identify one thing?
Well, Senator, again, I appreciate your confidence in my gut, but I rely on the analysis that we do at CBO. The risk of fiscal crisis, in our view, comes from the imbalance between spending and revenues. That imbalance comes in the projections because spending rises to a share of GDP that we have not seen before in this country, and revenues rise above their historical average, but not as far as spending in these baseline projections.
But what is it in the spending and in the revenue side that troubles you the most? What's the single thing?
Again, it's not a matter of troubling. It has to be your choice and your colleague's choice what parts of the budget you want to address. As an arithmetic matter, of course, the part of the spending that is growing very rapidly and growing much faster than GDP is spending on the government's large health care programs, both because of the aging of the population, and much of that money goes to older Americans, and because of rising health spending.
I'm encouraged by your answer because I think it is health care. And I think it's not just health care as it relates to Medicare and Medicaid, which obviously drives the growth of those programs. And your projections here of 7% growth is, in the chairman's words, unsustainable. But it also, of course, affects the private sector job growth, which leads to lower revenues than we'd otherwise have. So I'm going to take your answer to be health care, which I think is the right answer. What do you think the most significant risk is in your baseline projections?
I have a long list of worries, Senator. You know, I think in terms of the budget projection, as you said, these projections are notoriously wrong because there's a very difficult business. But the crucial underlying factor here, as we were just discussing, is the rising number of older Americans relative to working Americans, and the rising cost of health care relative to other things in the economy. And those fundamental forces have been foreseen for decades, and I think are inexorable under current policies. So although the specifics will undoubtedly not turn out this way, I think there's a reason that for many, many reports now, CBO and many outside analysts, of course, have been looking at a deteriorating fiscal picture. So I don't view that as
your projection. Do you feel the biggest risk is in the area of government expenditures on health care?
So I think that is one very large uncertainty.
How about interest rates? We talked about it earlier, but one of the concerns I have in looking at your analysis is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the risk premium that the private sector is looking at, and this is why the blue chip estimate I think is above yours, I don't see embodied in your analysis. Do you feel you take into account the risk premium of these higher debts?
Well, so in fact, our projection of long-term interest rates over this coming decade is actually above the interest rates that you can deduce from the current prices of Treasury securities in the financial markets. Our projection here reflects a combination of what we see in financial markets and our own modeling. Our own modeling actually points to interest rates being a little higher than the financial markets have built in, particularly in the latter half of the decade for the longer-term securities. So we've constructed a projection that puts some weight on our modeling and some weight on the financial markets. But I think the point, as we've made a number of times, is that the swings in sentiment that drive fiscal crises are not usually telegraphed very well ahead of time. They are often occur very suddenly.
Well, I would love some more information on the interest rate calculation. I think that's going to be obviously a big part of the uncertainty going forward, and I think it relates directly to the point that's been made many times here today, that we need to focus all of us, our constituents, American people, on this issue, and part of it is what's going to happen with rates, because that will affect everybody's everyday life as well as our business climate. Obviously, you know, three issues here: the discretionary side we've talked about today, the entitlement side, which we haven't talked about enough today. I wish I had more time. The third one is growing the economy, and we've talked some about that, and I applaud Senator Wyden, who's now left, but for his comments on tax reform. I would just ask you one simple question with regard to the corporate rate. There's some recent research, and you've probably seen it, I think it's Hassett and Brill, that says there's a maximization point in the corporate rate of about 26%. And I guess that's somewhat obvious. That's lower than or about at the average of the OECD or the developed country rates. Have you all looked at that, and do you think we're leaving revenue on the table right now? In other words, by having a relatively high corporate rate, are we getting less revenue than we would otherwise get? And do you think we have a misalignment here because of the competitive nature of the global economy? And what's your view on what the right corporate rate ought to be?
Senator, I'm sorry, I'm aware of that paper, but we have not studied that analysis carefully, so I can't directly answer your question. If you're interested in I'm interested, of course, myself. But more importantly, if you're interested, we can take a closer look at that.
Since we're both interested, let's get some views from CBO on that, because I think it's a very interesting analysis. And although, as you said earlier, whether tax relief pays for itself or not depends on the tax relief, that this is one area where we might be able to find a consensus. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'll be in touch, Senator. Thank you.